My name is Angela Pipkin, and I am 32 years old. Until a few weeks ago, I thought I was in a stable adult relationship built on mutual respect, shared routines, and the quiet certainty that comes from choosing the same person every day without having to question it. Thursday nights were our ritual. Nothing flashy, nothing performative, just comfort. I usually got home first and cooked something simple, the kind of meal you make when you expect to be eating with someone you trust. Lemon garlic chicken, roasted vegetables, pasta when we were tired. By the time my boyfriend Daniel Pipkin walked in from his consulting job, the apartment already felt lived in. Shoes kicked off near the door. A familiar sigh, 2 glasses of wine poured without asking. We'd sit at the kitchen island and debrief our days, complain lightly about coworkers, talk about shows we might watch later. We had been together for 3 years, long enough that love had settled into something quieter, long enough that I believed honesty was assumed. The first warning sign didn't arrive dramatically. It slipped in quietly disguised as nothing at all. Daniel's phone used to sit face up on the coffee table. One week I noticed it had started turning face down. He'd glance at messages, smile faintly, then smooth his expression when he realized I was looking. I told myself not to read into it. Trust, I believed, meant choosing not to invent threats where none had been proven. That Tuesday night, he casually mentioned an industry conference coming up over the weekend. Just a couple of seminars, he said, probably boring, but good for his annual review. When I asked where it was, he answered without hesitation. Downtown. The Marriott. I nodded and moved on. Why wouldn't I? We were talking about getting a dog next spring. You don't interrogate someone you're planning a future with. Thursday night, he texted that he'd be late. Last-minute prep. Slides to finalize. Logistics. I reheated dinner and opened my laptop to answer a work email, but the battery died before I could finish. Daniel's laptop was on the counter. I knew the password, our old apartment number, and his childhood dog's name, a shared detail from the early days when everything still felt intimate and mutual. Opening it didn't feel like crossing a boundary. It felt like using something we shared. His email was already open, and there it was, centered on the screen, not hidden or buried, almost as if it expected to be seen. A booking confirmation from the Riverside Hotel and Suites. Check-in Saturday. Check-out Sunday. 1 king bed. Guest name Daniel Pipkin. Additional guest Natalie Ross. Natalie Ross, his ex-girlfriend from college, the one with the complicated but harmless history, the one whose name surfaced just often enough to make me uncomfortable, but never enough until now to justify concern. I read the confirmation again. Then a third time. It wasn't a conference rate. It was a standard weekend booking. 1 room, 1 bed. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I poured myself another glass of wine and waited. Daniel came home 40 minutes later, smelling like cologne and confidence, smiling like nothing in the world had shifted. He asked how my night was while reaching for the wine bottle, already relaxed, already certain. I told him it was fine and asked as evenly as I could where the conference was again. The Marriott, he said, not looking at me. My laptop died, I replied. Yours was open. I saw the hotel confirmation. He froze just briefly before irritation took its place. His first instinct wasn't explanation. It was offense. You went through my email. It was open, I said calmly. You're sharing a hotel room with Natalie. He sighed, heavy and exaggerated, like I had exhausted him simply by noticing. He crossed his arms and told me it wasn't a big deal. Hotels were expensive. They were splitting the cost. It was just practical. Practical. I asked why he hadn't mentioned it. He rolled his eyes, the gesture sharp enough to sting. I didn't tell you because you'd be weird about it, he said with complete certainty, like he was stating a fact, not delivering a judgment. The words settled between us, heavier than the lie itself. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. It was a diagnosis of my character. The problem wasn't that he hid something significant. The problem was that my reaction, my feelings were inconvenient. I looked at him then and felt something inside me grow very still. I nodded once. Okay, I said. Relief flickered across his face. He mistook my clarity for surrender, my silence for compliance. I walked past him into the bedroom and closed the door softly. In the dark, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I planned. Every word he had used against me formed a framework. Any reaction would be framed as insecurity, any emotion as drama. So I chose the only response he had left me. Distance. I lay awake longer than I expected that night, not because my mind was racing, but because it felt unnervingly calm. Daniel fell asleep quickly beside me, his breathing evening out. Within minutes, as if nothing significant had happened. That more than anything else clarified the situation. To him, the conversation in the kitchen hadn't been a rupture. It had been a minor inconvenience he believed he'd successfully managed. He had framed my potential reaction as the problem, and once I removed that reaction, he considered the issue resolved. In the dark, I replayed the exchange without emotion, almost clinically. The hotel room wasn't the sharpest wound. The king bed wasn't even the point. What lodged itself under my skin was the sigh, the eye roll, the casual way he decided my feelings were something to be worked around instead of addressed. He hadn't trusted me with the truth because he didn't respect me enough to handle it. In his mind, I wasn't a partner. I was a variable to be controlled. Morning came quietly. I woke before the alarm and lay still listening to the soft hum of the apartment and the distant traffic outside. Daniel stirred, at some point checked his phone, and muttered something about an early meeting. He kissed my forehead absently before getting up already halfway back in his head, his confidence restored by my silence. There was no apology, no attempt to revisit the conversation, just the assumption that my okay the night before had closed the subject permanently. While he showered, I stood in the kitchen and looked around the space we'd built together. The coffee mugs we bought on our second vacation. The plant I kept alive mostly out of stubbornness. The framed photo of us at the beach smiling into the sun like people who believed they were safe. Everything looked the same, but the meaning had drained out of it. The apartment wasn't a home anymore. It was a set. Daniel emerged dressed and efficient, grabbing a piece of toast on his way out. "I'll be late again tonight," he said casually. "Final prep before the conference." I nodded, watching him slip his jacket on. He paused for half a second, studying my face, as if checking for cracks, then relaxed when he found none. "See?" he said lightly. "Not a big deal." The door closed behind him, and the sound of the lock clicking into place felt louder than it ever had before. I stood there for a long moment, absorbing the silence, and understood something with uncomfortable clarity. If I stayed, this would become the pattern. Decisions made without me. Truth filtered through his assessment of my convenience. Respect replaced by management. I didn't pack immediately. I sat at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee I didn't finish and made a mental inventory instead. What was mine? What was his? What we had pretended was shared, but had always rested on my willingness to be accommodating. The realization didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It steadied me. By the time evening approached, my plan was no longer emotional. It was logistical. I booked a hotel across town for the week ahead, something clean and impersonal, a place with no history attached to it. I emailed my manager to let her know I'd be working remotely for a few days. Everything was framed in neutral language, the same tone Daniel had used on me. Efficient, practical. That night, when he came home late and tired, I was already in bed. He slid in beside me and exhaled, satisfied, secure, in the belief that whatever potential conflict existed had been avoided. As he drifted off, I stared at the ceiling and felt the final emotional tether loosen. I wasn't angry. I wasn't devastated. I was finished. The lie hadn't ended our relationship. The way he told it and the way he dismissed me for noticing had. I woke at 5:42 a.m., before the alarm, before the city had fully shaken itself awake. Daniel was asleep beside me, turned slightly away, his breathing slow and even. I watched the rise and fall of his shoulders for a moment, not with longing or regret, but with the detached awareness that this was the last ordinary thing we would ever share. There was no spike of emotion, no cinematic surge of sadness, just a clean, hollow certainty. I moved carefully the way you do when you don't want to disturb someone, even though disturbing him no longer mattered. The bedroom light stayed off as I dressed in silence and stepped into the living room. The apartment felt different at that hour, less like a shared space and more like a temporary holding area I was about to vacate. I started with the essentials, my laptop charger, work documents, passport, then clothes. Enough for the week. Enough to function. I folded methodically, not rushing, not hesitating, each item placed with intention rather than sentiment. There were things I left behind without debate. The sweater he'd given me last Christmas stayed on the chair. The novelty mug from our first road trip remained in the cupboard. These weren't sacrifices, they were acknowledgments. Objects only mattered if they were tied to a future, and this one had already been quietly dismantled. In the bathroom, I cleared my side of the cabinet. Toothbrush, skincare, the expensive shampoo he'd teased me for buying. I left the shared items untouched. The apartment didn't need to look empty. It needed to look altered subtly but unmistakably, like a place someone had exited rather than stormed out of. By 7:00 a.m., most of my life was in the trunk of my car. I'd parked it in the back lot the night before out of habit more than strategy, and made 2 quiet trips down the stairwell. The morning air was cool grounding. With every box I set down, the decision felt more real and more irreversible. When I heard the shower turn on upstairs, I knew I was on borrowed time, but I didn't rush. There was no panic to outrun. Back in the kitchen, I stood at the island, where we'd spent so many ordinary evenings, and took out a sheet of printer paper and a pen. I didn't need to explain myself. Explanations would invite debate, and debate was exactly what I was avoiding. His words from the night before had already written the script for me. I copied them faithfully. Didn't want to be weird about it. My key is on the counter. Do not contact me. Angela. I placed the note in the center of the island and set my key beside it, the soft click of metal against stone echoing in the quiet room. It felt ceremonial, not dramatic. Final without being cruel. I did one last walkthrough, checking corners out of habit rather than attachment. The apartment looked almost the same, but the absence was already registering. A gap on the bookshelf, an empty drawer. The kind of changes you don't notice all at once, but feel later when you reach for something that's no longer there. I closed the door behind me gently and waited until I heard the lock engage. Only then did I exhale. Sitting in the driver's seat, hands steady on the wheel, I waited for the rush of emotion I'd been bracing for. It didn't come. What settled instead was a vast, quiet neutrality. Not relief, not grief, space. My phone buzzed with a work reminder as I pulled out of the lot, anchoring me back in the mundane. I drove across town to the hotel I'd booked the night before and checked in without incident. The room was anonymous and clean stripped of memory. I set my suitcase down, opened the curtains just enough to let in light, and sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in 3 years, there was no one in the next room whose moods I had to anticipate, no narrative I had to manage. I lay back and stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, breathing slowly, deliberately. Whatever came next would be hard, but it would be honest. And that was enough to start with. I slept longer than I had in months. Not the restless kind of sleep that leaves you more exhausted when you wake, but something deep and unbroken, like my body had finally been given permission to shut everything down. When I opened my eyes late Saturday morning, the hotel room felt suspended from the rest of the world. No familiar sounds, no shared routines, no one else's energy pressing in on mine, just stillness. The first thing I did wasn't emotional, it was administrative. I changed my passwords. Email, banking apps, cloud storage, streaming services that had once been ours, but had always technically lived under my name. I removed Daniel as my emergency contact at work and updated my mailing address to a temporary hold. None of it felt petty. It felt like closing accounts on a business that had quietly gone bankrupt. Only after everything was secured did I turn my phone off airplane mode. It lit up immediately. Missed calls. Texts stacked on top of each other, timestamps creeping forward as the tone shifted. The first messages were confused, almost gentle. Where are you? Are you okay? Did something happen? Then irritation crept in. This isn't funny. You can't just disappear. By Saturday evening, the irritation hardened into accusation. You're seriously doing this over a misunderstanding. You always overreact. I read them without responding, noticing what wasn't there. No apology, no acknowledgement of the lie, no recognition of how dismissive he'd been. Just variations of the same premise that my leaving was the real offense. Sunday morning brought a different tone. Please, Angela, I'm coming home today. We should talk. I'm sorry if I wasn't totally transparent. Transparent. A word designed to sound responsible while avoiding responsibility. Still no ownership, still no respect. I didn't block his number yet. Not because I wanted to engage, but because watching the progression told me everything I needed to know. Confusion gave way to entitlement remarkably fast. The silence I offered him was doing something arguments never could. It was forcing him to sit alone with the consequences of his choices. By Monday, the messages weren't just coming from him. Mutual friends began reaching out carefully, testing the waters. Are you okay? Heard you and Daniel had a fight. I answered each one the same way, calm and factual, without embellishment or emotion. Asked Daniel about the Riverside Hotel booking he made to share a room with Natalie. Once you hear his explanation, you'll understand why I left. I wasn't defending myself, I was redirecting. The truth didn't need performance, it only needed to be seen. The responses trickled in slowly, but they all followed a similar pattern. Long pauses, short replies, subtle shifts in tone. Oh, I didn't know that part. That's different from how he explained it. A few people didn't respond at all after that. I suspected they were confronting him, or perhaps realizing they didn't want to be involved in something that wasn't as clean as they'd hoped. That evening, one of Daniel's closest friends called me directly. His voice was cautious, stripped of the usual, easy confidence. Angela, he said, Daniel's really upset. He says you just vanished. I didn't vanish, I replied evenly. I left. He hesitated. He told us it was about you getting uncomfortable with Natalie being in town. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to choose precision. He booked a hotel room with her. One room. One bed. He didn't tell me. When I found out, he said he hid it because I'd be weird about it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not the polite kind. The kind where someone is recalibrating. Oh, he said finally. Yeah, that's not nothing. No, I agreed. It isn't. I hung up feeling neither vindicated nor satisfied, just confirmed. The narrative was shifting without me lifting a finger. Daniel was no longer the abandoned boyfriend in a sudden crisis. He was the man who had gambled on secrecy and lost control of the story. That night, lying in the hotel bed with the city humming distantly outside, I understood something important. Silence wasn't cruelty. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. I wasn't withholding myself to make him suffer. I was withholding myself because I no longer belonged in the situation he had created. And for the first time since I'd found that hotel confirmation, I didn't feel hollow. I felt steady. By midweek, the truth had begun to move on its own, no longer dependent on me to carry it. I could feel it through the subtle changes in how people spoke to me, the careful phrasing of messages that replaced easy assumptions. The silence I'd maintained created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, facts slowly drifted. Daniel's version of events, once neat and sympathetic, started developing cracks. One afternoon, a mutual friend called, not to persuade me not to mediate, but to clarify. She sounded uncomfortable, like someone who had realized too late that they'd already taken a side. Angela, she said carefully. Daniel didn't mention the hotel room being shared. He said Natalie had her own space. I only found out because someone else asked him directly. I thanked her for telling me and ended the call without commentary. I wasn't collecting allies. I was watching cause and effect unfold. When a story relies on omission to survive, it collapses the moment people start asking better questions. The next update came indirectly. Natalie Ross, the ex-girlfriend who had once been framed as irrelevant, was no longer a footnote. She was the center of the explanation now. Daniel had shifted from minimizing her role to over-explaining it. She was between places. She needed help. It was temporary. She was struggling. Each justification widened the gap between what he'd said initially and what was now coming out in fragments. What he'd called practical was starting to look reckless. What he'd called harmless was starting to look like poor judgment at best and opportunism at worst. Through someone who worked near his office, I learned that Natalie hadn't been in town for any conference at all. There were no seminars, no badges, no colleagues. She had arrived with luggage and no plan beyond Daniel. The shared hotel room hadn't been about convenience. It had been about access. That knowledge didn't ignite anger in me. It settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle I had already stopped working on. Daniel, meanwhile, was unraveling in ways that felt both predictable and strangely distant. His texts grew longer, more erratic. He swung between insisting I had misunderstood everything and accusing me of destroying his life by leaving. One night, a voicemail slipped through before I blocked unknown numbers. His voice sounded raw, edged with panic, rather than remorse. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain," he said. "You just walked away. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I deleted it without replaying. The question answered itself. What I had done was remove myself from a situation where my feelings were treated as liabilities. Everything happening after that was simply gravity. As the days passed, the consequences extended beyond his emotional state. Daniel's financial situation, which had always been quietly propped up by our combined income, was beginning to strain. The apartment lease was in my name. The utilities followed. When I'd left, I'd paid the final month required by contract, but nothing beyond that. I wasn't punishing him. I was complying with obligations, no more and no less. Without me, his margin vanished. Natalie didn't leave town after the weekend either. Temporary stretched into indefinite. What had been framed as a favor turned into an inconvenience, then a burden. Through the informal network of people who talk when they think they're being discreet, I heard that they argued frequently. That she borrowed money and didn't repay it. That she treated the apartment like it was already hers. The fantasy Daniel had leaned on to justify his secrecy was curdling into something heavy and inescapable. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. I felt distance. My own life was moving forward in quieter ways. I'd started looking at apartments across town places Daniel had always dismissed as impractical or boring. I went to the gym early in the mornings, enjoying the physical exhaustion that left no room for rumination. I cooked meals for myself without checking anyone else's preferences. The absence in my evenings wasn't empty, it was clean. The shift in social dynamics became unmistakable by the end of the week. Invitations that once went through Daniel started coming directly to me. Conversations felt less guarded. People weren't asking me to reconsider anymore. They were asking how I was doing. The narrative had changed without me arguing for it. That was the most telling part. If I'd stayed and fought, the story would have been framed as mutual dysfunction. By leaving quietly, I'd allowed the truth to stand on its own. Daniel tried once more to regain control. He sent a message stripped of defensiveness, carefully worded, almost professional. He admitted he should have told me about Natalie. He said he handled it poorly. He asked if we could meet just to talk, just to get closure. The request was reasonable on the surface, but I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to pull me back into a dynamic where my presence absorbed the impact of his choices. I didn't reply. The truth no longer needed my participation to function. It was doing its work without me steadily and without drama. And for the first time since the night I found that booking confirmation, I understood that leaving hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. By the time a full month had passed, my life no longer felt like something I was recovering. It felt like something I was actively building. I signed a lease on a one-bedroom apartment across the river in a neighborhood Daniel had always dismissed as inconvenient and too quiet. That quiet turned out to be exactly what I needed. The windows faced the water instead of traffic. The mornings felt slower, more deliberate. Every decision about the space was mine alone: what furniture to buy, where the light fell, how much emptiness I was willing to tolerate while I filled it gradually. Moving in was a solitary project, and I found that I liked it that way. There was no negotiation over aesthetics, no compromise disguised as reasonableness. I chose neutral colors, clean lines, and furniture that prioritized comfort over impressing anyone else. The echo in the apartment wasn't lonely. It was spacious. It gave my thoughts room to land without colliding into someone else's expectations. Daniel's life, from what filtered through the same informal channels I never asked for, was contracting rather than expanding. Natalie was still there. What had begun as a temporary arrangement had hardened into something more permanent, not by design, but by inertia. She hadn't found work. She hadn't left. The dynamic between them had shifted from nostalgic familiarity to constant friction. The woman who had once represented excitement and escape was now a daily reminder of a decision he couldn't undo. Financial pressure crept in quietly. The rent he'd once split without thinking was now a monthly panic. Bills that had been background noise were suddenly loud. I heard that he'd tried to renegotiate the lease only to discover that qualifying on his income alone wasn't possible. His lifestyle had been balanced on the assumption of my presence, and without it the math no longer worked. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative around him changed, once I was no longer there to soften it. When I'd been part of his life, his missteps were framed as quirks. His omissions were misunderstandings. His impulsive decisions were reframed as confidence. Without me, those same traits looked like what they were: carelessness, avoidance, entitlement. I hadn't realized how often I'd acted as a buffer, absorbing the consequences before they could reach him. I didn't celebrate that realization. I simply noted it. Professionally, my own world was stabilizing in ways that surprised me. I was more focused at work, less distracted by emotional maintenance. I spoke up in meetings without second-guessing myself. My manager commented casually but pointedly that I seemed more grounded lately. The observation stayed with me longer than she probably intended. I hadn't changed my skills. I'd changed my environment. Occasionally, Daniel would attempt to reinsert himself, a text framed as concern, a message that hinted at nostalgia without acknowledging cause. Each time I felt the same quiet resistance rise up. Responding would reopen a door I had deliberately closed. Silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was alignment. The final piece of information came from someone who meant well, but didn't realize how unnecessary it was. Natalie, it turned out, had borrowed a significant amount of money from Daniel and hadn't paid it back. When he'd confronted her, she'd accused him of misleading her of promising stability he couldn't provide. The irony was sharp, but unsurprising. A relationship built on secrecy rarely survives scrutiny. I listened, nodded, and changed the subject. Revenge would have required engagement, emotional investment, a desire to see him hurt. I didn't feel any of that. What I felt was distance, healthy, deliberate distance. His consequences weren't something I'd engineered. They were the natural result of decisions made without accountability. One evening, sitting on the floor of my new apartment with a takeout container balanced on my knee, I realized I hadn't checked my phone for hours. No compulsion, no vigilance, no underlying anxiety waiting for something to go wrong. The absence of that constant low-level tension felt almost luxurious. I wasn't winning against Daniel. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply no longer participating in a story that required me to shrink myself so someone else could feel comfortable. And that I understood then was the quietest kind of power. The confrontation didn't happen the way movies like to script these moments. There was no dramatic coincidence, no perfectly timed encounter fueled by fate. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, nearly 2 months after I had left, when my life had already settled into a new rhythm that no longer made room for him. I had just finished a late workout and was walking through the parking garage beneath my gym, my hair still damp, my bag slung over my shoulder. I was thinking about dinner, about whether I felt like cooking or ordering something simple, when I noticed a familiar figure leaning against one of the concrete pillars. Daniel straightened when he saw me, as if he'd been bracing himself for longer than he wanted to admit. "You're hard to find," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its old confidence. "I had to follow one of your coworkers online to figure out where you might be." That alone told me how far he'd crossed. I stopped a few feet away from him, keeping my keys in my hand, the distance between us deliberate and unmoving. "You shouldn't be here," I said calmly. He laughed once sharply, the sound edged with disbelief. "I just needed to talk to you. You disappeared, Angela. After everything, you didn't even fight. You didn't argue. You just left like I didn't matter." I studied him in the harsh fluorescent lighting. He looked thinner, more drawn. The ease he used to carry himself with was gone, replaced by something anxious and brittle. His distress was real, but it wasn't the kind born from reflection. It was the distress of someone who had lost control of the situation. "I did fight," I replied. "I fought by leaving." "That's not fighting," he snapped. "That's running. You didn't give me a chance to explain. It was one night, one practical decision, and you destroyed everything over it." There it was again. Practical. The same word resurrected like a shield. I felt no anger rise in response, only a steady clarity. "I didn't leave because of one night," I said. "I left because you decided my feelings were something to manage instead of respect. You told me the truth would be inconvenient because I'd be weird about it. That wasn't a mistake. That was a judgment." He dragged a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping again. "She's gone," he said quickly. "Natalie's gone. She took money and left. I cut her out completely. It's just me now. Doesn't that count for something?" It was an offer thinly disguised as a confession, proof of punishment presented as redemption. I shook my head slowly. "You didn't remove her because you understood what you did to me," I said. "You removed her because she became a problem. Those aren't the same thing." His expression tightened. "So that's it. You live in your quiet little apartment, go to your gym, rebuild your perfect life, and I just get erased." "You weren't erased," I said. "You were released." The words landed harder than I expected them to. He stared at me stunned, as if the idea had never occurred to him, that I hadn't been trying to hurt him, that I had simply stopped carrying him. "You're cold," he said finally. "You used to care." "I cared when I was respected," I answered. "I stopped when I wasn't." Silence stretched between us, heavy but unforced. He looked around the garage as if searching for an audience that wasn't there for validation he wasn't getting from me. When he spoke again, his voice sharpened with frustration. "You're enjoying this, watching me fall apart." I met his gaze without flinching. "If I were enjoying it, I would have stayed to see it up close," I said. "I didn't. That should tell you everything." His jaw clenched. The desperation shifted, hardening into resentment. "You'll regret this," he said. "People don't walk away like this and end up happy." I smiled faintly, not out of spite, but recognition. I already am. I unlocked my car and opened the door. He stepped back, finally understanding that this conversation was over. As I pulled out of the garage, I saw him standing alone in the rearview mirror, smaller than I remembered, no longer framed as a loss, but as a chapter that had already ended. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. 6 months after I left my life, no longer carried the emotional residue of what had happened. Daniel existed as a fact in my past, not a presence in my thoughts. The distance wasn't something I worked at anymore. It was simply there, natural and complete, like a scar that no longer aches when the weather changes. On a Saturday afternoon, I found myself in the gourmet grocery store near my apartment, moving slowly through the aisles, choosing things based purely on preference, rather than compromise. My cart held fresh herbs, thick-cut ribeye steaks, mushrooms I planned to sauté in butter, and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a quiet dinner with friends who had shown up for me without asking questions or taking sides. This was my life now, intentional, unhurried, solid. I was comparing two kinds of sea salt when I felt someone stop at the end of the aisle. The awareness came before recognition. When I looked up, it was Daniel. The contrast was immediate and unsettling. I was wearing dark jeans and a soft sweater, relaxed, unguarded, comfortable in my own skin. He looked worn down in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with stress. His posture was slumped, his expression uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to exist in my line of sight. In his hands was a small basket containing a frozen meal, discounted tea bags, and a single candy bar. "You look good," he said quietly. "Thank you," I replied, polite but distant. "How are you?" The question was automatic, stripped of any emotional investment. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to my cart and then back to his own. "Not great," he admitted. "I lost the apartment." Natalie cleaned out my savings before she left. "I'm staying with my sister for now, working something temporary." I nodded, absorbing the information without reaction. "I'm sorry to hear that." The words were correct but empty. I wasn't sorry in the way he wanted me to be. I wasn't grieving his loss. I was acknowledging it the same way you acknowledge bad weather. "I think about us all the time," he said suddenly. "About what I ruined. I made a terrible mistake, Angela. The biggest of my life. If I could take it back." That moment passed, I said gently, cutting him off before he could finish. "Not because you shared a hotel room, because you decided honesty with me was optional and respect was negotiable. That was the choice. Everything after was just the aftermath." He swallowed hard. "So that's it?" he asked. "You move on, buy nice groceries, build this new life, and I'm just gone." "I didn't erase you," I said. "I outgrew the version of myself that accepted less than I deserved." He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw understanding finally take shape behind his eyes. Not hope, not bargaining, just recognition. The realization that what he had lost wasn't replaceable, not because I was extraordinary, but because I had been steady, and steady people don't come back once they leave. I accepted a new position, I added calmly. "Director level. I'm moving cities next month." His face fell. The finality of geography made the loss real in a way words hadn't. "You're leaving." "Yes," I said, "it's time." There was nothing else to say. I wished him well without warmth or malice, pushed my cart past him, and walked toward the checkout. I didn't look back. I paid for my food, loaded my bags into the car, and drove home, thinking not about him, but about the evening ahead. The sound of laughter in my apartment, the comfort of routines chosen freely, the peace that no longer felt fragile. Daniel had once told me I'd be weird about the truth. What he never expected was that I would be strong enough to walk away quietly and